Friedman, the director of the Miami, Florida European Union Center of Excellence here at FIU. And I am so pleased and privileged today to be able to introduce to you such distinguished colleagues, former colleagues of mine. Let me just go ahead and jump in and introduce them right away since we're already running a bit late. First we have Dr. Ralph Clem, who is a retired professor of international relations, also the former and founding chair of the advisory board of the School of International Affairs at FIU. He received his PhD degree in geography and Soviet studies, when there was such a thing, from Columbia University in 1975. Dr. Clem is the author, co-author, or editor of many, many books and scholarly articles and papers on the Soviet nationalities problem, population trends in the USSR, and the electoral geography of Russia. Dr. Clem has held many prestigious fellowship positions, including one at the Kennan Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and also the Harriman Institute of Columbia University, the two kind of prominent ones where he could have been. He was awarded the Ryder Corporation Excellence in Teaching Award and the Professional Excellence Award of the State University System of Florida. We're so pleased to have him here today to talk with us about what's going on in Ukraine and to share all of his many years of expertise. We also have as commentator today Professor Tatiana Kostadinova, who received her PhD from Florida State University in 2000. Her research and teaching interests include political institutions with a special emphasis on electoral systems and reform, Eastern European democratic transition, and comparative public policy. She too has been the recipient of a number of grants and fellowships, including those from the American Political Science Organization and a fellowship program award from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Professor Konstantinova's first book, Bulgaria, 1879 to 1946, The Challenge of Choice, explores the Bulgarian parliamentary elections, political strategies, and voter behavior. I got that wrong. That was the next book. Sorry. No, I didn't. I got that right. Okay, good. And her 2012 book, Political Corruption in Eastern Europe, Politics After Communism, analyzes the emergence of corruption as a major obstacle to success in democratic transition. So we have two experts here today to share their ideas and thoughts about what's going on in Ukraine. So without any further ado, let me introduce today's talk, Ukraine and the Revenge of Geography. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll kind of wander if you don't mind. And I am by training a geographer, hence the title of this presentation. I'll try to bring to this the perspective of somebody who professionally deals with this subject and how it relates to the ongoing, and I stress ongoing, crisis in Ukraine. Had to check the news wire just before the talk started to make sure that something hadn't happened this morning there, because it's a rapidly unfolding situation, and you'll be pleased to know that now interjected into the middle of this is none other than George Clooney, the actor, who has recently, was at a press conference in Berlin about his new film, The Monument Men, which you may have seen advertised, yes? Who else is in that movie? Anyway, a lot of big names in that movie. And at the press conference, he was asked a question about what's going on in Ukraine, and he actually had an informed opinion about it, which if you know him and his social activism maybe isn't too surprising. But in any event, a lot going on there. Let's do just a little quick remedial work on Ukraine, because a lot of people, frankly, probably don't even know where it is. If they do know where it is, maybe they don't know about its historical and, more importantly, its geographical attributes, and I want to make sure we set the stage for the discussion that comes later. Here it is. The name actually, in the Slavic languages, means frontier or borderland, and that's an apt term because it is exactly that. What I want you to see from this map is on one side is Russia and on the other side is Germany, and in between are a number of countries that we refer to as either Central or Eastern European countries. That's important because essentially what that belt or band of countries from Poland and Lithuania in the north down through Romania, and yes, Bulgaria in the south are in a kind of a buffer zone, a fracture zone, a borderland, a frontier region, historically caught between Russian power to the east, German power to the west, and that theme will recur. Real quickly again, here's what the place looks like. It's a large population. If you don't include Russia, it would be the 7th most populous country in Europe, behind Spain, and it would be the largest country in Europe, as a previous slide showed. The largest geographically country in Europe, if you don't include Russia. So it's a big place with a lot of people, roughly 2/3 to 3/4 urban. Median age, relatively old. Look at life expectancy. That's what E sub 0 means, life expectancy at birth. For women, well, a little bit behind the European countries, but look at the figure for men. That's about equivalent to West Africa. And as a consequence of that, you have a very slowly growing population and a relatively old population. The UNDP, which is probably our best source of comparative international social and economic data, UNDP calculates an index called the Human Development Index, the HDI. And if you ever want to do international comparisons, that's probably your best place to start. Ukraine ranks relatively low on that scale. It's the 78th down from the top country on the UNDP's HDI scale, which means that compared to most of its Eastern European and Central European neighbors, and even compared to Russia, it's relatively behind in that regard. Another really important background fact about Ukraine is its ethnic composition. Obviously, not everybody who lives in Ukraine is Ukrainian by ethnic self-identification. What ethnic group do you belong to? I'm Ukrainian, or I'm something else, right? The largest minority population, very, very importantly in Ukraine, are the Russians. And actually, Russians are more important than their self-identified number, because language is a very important issue there, and by the way, is politically a radioactive issue, like it is in a lot of multi-ethnic countries. Ukrainian is the official language of the country, but Russian is very widely used, including very widely used by Ukrainians. So it gets kind of complicated. The point being that the Russian minority presence is large numerically, but even more important culturally and especially politically, as we'll come to find out. Notice that the Russian speakers and the ethnic Russians are concentrated in the eastern part of the country. That will become extremely important as we go along. I'm going to approach this from a geopolitical point of view. Geopolitics, the combination of geography and politics. The name conjures up, actually, in intellectual history, some unsavory aspects. Hitler was a devotee of geopolitics, the wrong kind of geopolitics, but geopolitics nonetheless. The idea that the Germans were destined to rule Central and Eastern Europe and the western part of Russia was an idea that Hitler got from a prominent geopolitician. We're not going to talk about those kind of racist or ethnically biased geopolitics. We're going to talk about real geopolitics, which means we're going to talk about the importance of location. Where is a place, just practically speaking? What countries surround it, practically speaking, is hugely important in the way in which a country's role in the world or role in a region is defined. We're going to talk about size. The size of a place is important. The size of Russia, for example, historically was extremely important in what happened historically in that country. Napoleon found it out the hard way, and Hitler found it out the hard way. So a very large country, a continental country like the United States, like Russia, or like Ukraine, the size of the place is an important element in what happens historically in that particular place. And place, location and place. What do we mean by place? What are the attributes of the place? What's its climate? What are its economic resources? Does it have petroleum and natural gas and iron ore and coal? What about its population? Are they well educated? Are they relatively healthy? What's the balance between men and women? What are the any kind of a social or an economic or geographical aspect of the place becomes important. So space and place are the ways that political geographers, geopoliticians look at regions. And it's become very popular now. This is a nationally best-selling book. Bob Kaplan is a reporter, journalist, kind of quasi-academic guy, has a big new book out now called The Revenge of Geography. I strongly recommend it. It's good reading, easy reading. You don't have to agree with all of it, but it certainly has some elements that are interesting. I pulled out 3 quotes here because I want to discuss very briefly the highlighted letters. Position, what are we talking about there? What I just said before. Where is the place? What are its physical attributes? How would World War II have turned out had Britain not been an island? Right? What was the main problem the Germans faced in 40, 41, 42? Getting across the channel. Couldn't get across the channel. Well, the British Royal Air Force had something to do with that. But what if Britain had not been an island? A simple geographical fact. Right? What about place? What about a country like Poland? Again, caught between Germany to the west, Russia to the east, crushed historically. Only now, really, in the post-World War I era, post-World War II era, do we have a viable, independent Poland as a sovereign state. Determinist. Geographers sometimes are, I think, incorrectly labeled as determinist. Do the qualities of a place, do the location of a place in and of themselves determine outcomes? No, because there's human agency. A relatively small landlocked country, Switzerland, they've done okay, right? By the rules of geopolitics, Switzerland should be a basket case, but it's doing fine. Thank you very much. Probably number 3, 4, or 5 on the UNDP HDI list, right? So geography is not deterministic. It's influential in the way that events unfold. And then finally, realism. If you're an IR person, this is Morgenthau. There's a very strong overlap between geopolitics and realism as a school of thought in IR. And Morgenthau, of course, would be the ultimate source for that kind of thing. So if you read Kaplan, Kaplan goes to great lengths to incorporate Morgenthau's ideas about how we ought to approach the world from a realism perspective, geopolitical perspective. Okay, now let's get to Ukraine specifically. This is Ukraine at the turn of the 20th century. These are Tsarist, the old Tsarist Russian Empire. These are Tsarist provinces in the pre-World War I period. The gray line that goes around those provinces is the current border of Ukraine today, the current border of Ukraine. Okay, so when you look at that, you can say a couple of different things. Whoa, the border has moved. And did it ever move, right? Because it's an area where empires have pushed each other back and forth for centuries. Germans, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, and previously to that, the Ottoman Empire. We're all engaged in this particular part of the world, and those borders, it's a borderland, it's a frontier. And as a consequence of that, it's an unstable place from the political geographical perspective. Lots of border changes occurring over time, including right up to the present. And it is an area that has undergone horrific population losses due to war, due to famine, civil disturbances, terror, mostly by communist, but not exclusively communist regimes. The plaque in the upper right-hand corner says, in 1940 in Ukraine, there lived 41.3 million people. By 1945, 27.4 million people. That doesn't include the 6 to 9 million people in Ukraine who died in the famine in the 1930s. Doesn't include all of the people who died in the World War I and post-World War I period. Timothy Snyder, a very famous historian, wrote a magnificent book called Bloodlands, and I've borrowed that title here. Magnificent book. Somewhere between 30 and 35 million people in this borderland region, not just Ukraine, but also Belarus, Eastern Poland, in that zone of conflict, in that zone, that borderland zone. In the 20th century, roughly 30 to 35 million dead from unnatural causes, right? Incredible death and destruction. 1924, USSR is created after the First World War. The USSR was a federation of ethnically based, quote-unquote, republics, of which the one to your left in yellow is the Ukrainian Republic. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, you see it there on the map. How did that come to be? Because of this guy. Remember him? One of the great monsters of all time. Also a very effective geopolitician in his own right. Managed to come out of World War II in pretty good shape, geographically in pretty good shape. But most important, notice the term national informed socialist in content. That those republics from the old Soviet Union are ethnically based republics, right? A Russian republic, a Ukrainian republic, an Uzbek republic, and so on. Oops. But then it all came apart. You may be too young to remember. We're certainly not. It was a wild and crazy time. Gorbachev on the left, Yeltsin there by the tank on the right. The USSR collapsed, and out of the USSR came the wreckage. All the countries of the US, all the republics of the USSR, all 15 of them became independent states. They are independent states today, all members of the UN, fully sovereign states in every sense of the word. But here's a very important point. All 15 of those countries, of those states, came out of the Soviet Union in exactly the same form geographically that they existed in the Soviet Union. The borders, in other words, of the Ukraine on the left, Soviet outline map, and the Ukraine on the right, the new sovereign independent Ukraine, are exactly the same. Those borders did not change. Well, what does that mean? It means the legitimacy of the state, the Ukrainian independent state today, derives specifically, ironically, from what the Soviets did when they set it up, right? So there was no adjustment of borders. You might have said, for example, well, wait a second, if all the ethnic Russians, or most of them, live in the east, why don't we just carve that part out and attach that to Russia? Since it's geographically contiguous, that'd make good sense, right? That didn't happen. It happened nowhere in the Soviet Union where those borders adjusted. Maybe a lost opportunity, but the point is that now you live with the consequences, right? Ukrainian leadership, it's Chris Matthews who commentates on American politics on MSNBC, referred to the Republican primary campaign in the last election as the clown car, where all these different guys kept getting, or people kept getting out of it, and they all got knocked down in the primary campaign. This is kind of a clown car. All of these guys are either crooks or inept, or both, from one to the other. Kravchuk was a massive crook, so bad in a country where corruption is taken for granted. Kravchuk was so bad that he had to quit. Replaced by a guy, Kuchma, who was not only corrupt, but he was brutal. Kuchma's regime eventually collapsed kind of its own weight, especially after he had a leading anti-regime journalist kidnapped and beheaded. That was too much even for the Ukrainians to take. So Kuchma went, and that's what we call, you may remember, the Orange Revolution of 04-05, after which was installed Viktor Yushchenko. Right? Yushchenko, nice guy, Ukrainian nationalist, a Ukrainian person. Names ending in Anko are almost always Ukrainian names. A good guy, you may recall, he was poisoned by the KGB back in a few years prior to this. He was badly disfigured on account of that. He survived, eventually became president of Ukraine. Good guy, nice guy, totally inept. Totally inept. The government essentially just kind of wallowed along until eventually in 2010, the guy who's there now, Yanukovych, it's easy, right? 2 Leonids and 2 Victors. The new Victor, Yanukovych, is not even an ethnic Ukrainian. He's from eastern Ukraine. His origins are Belarusian and Russian. He had to learn how to speak Ukrainian, which he speaks poorly. But that's okay, he doesn't have to because he's president. He's supposed to by law, but he's president. And he's a massive crook. A crook of almost unimaginable proportions. I mean, somewhere over $5 billion a year unaccountably flows into his family. And an equal, if not larger amount, flows into his cronies. And this is a country that's desperately struggling to move ahead. If there was a hope, it was her. This is Yulia Tymoshenko. She was prime minister during the Yushchenko regime. She was one of the architects of the Orange Revolution. She and Yushchenko fell out. They fought between themselves. They created, somebody once said, if you put 2 Ukrainians together in a room, they'll form 3 political parties. And that's probably pretty much true. Probably pretty much true. She and Yushchenko split. What happened in the 2010 election was, guess what? Split the vote so that the pro-Russian, pro-Eastern Ukrainian Yanukovych was able to win. One of the first things Yanukovych did was throw her in jail. She continues to be in jail. She's a prisoner of conscience, adopted by several of the international NGO human rights organizations and by George Clooney. George Clooney mentioned her in his Berlin press conference. One of the things I always wanted to know about her was how long it takes to do that hair. Obviously, it's something I don't have to worry about, but it's pretty spectacular hair. There's one picture that I know of that shows her with her hair down, but she's usually shown that way. She might have been the one who could have pulled off a legitimate, relatively effective, relatively non-corrupt Ukrainian government. It failed, and she languishes in jail. Okay, what's happened since? What happened since all this stuff has taken place? 2 big changes in the neighborhood, right? First one, NATO expansion. Who, in their wildest imaginations, in the early 1990s, who would have thought that Poland and Lithuania and Bulgaria would become NATO members? Well, they are. Okay, think about this. Ukraine, of course, isn't, and is once again caught in the middle between NATO and, guess who? Russia. How do you think Russia feels about all this? Not real happy about it, right? Not excited about it at all. Threatened by it. Actively speak out against it. Okay, another change in the hood. EU enlargement. NATO expansion, EU enlargement. I don't know why those 2 words are used that way, but they are. Again, take a look at the map. All those countries, the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, EU countries. Who saw that coming? There it is. How do you think the Russians feel about that? They're not real excited about that. Where's Ukraine? Caught in the middle. That's what the current crisis is, at least on the surface, about. Yanukovych had a choice between opting for a European-oriented, IMF-backed economic bailout package or taking $15 billion from the Russians. Guess what he chose? He chose the Russian option. And very shortly thereafter, people went into the streets. Okay, upper left-hand map is a map that shows where most of the protests, the anti-regime protests, most of the violence has been occurring that you see online, you see it in newspapers, see it on TV news, the striped areas. And the map on the lower right is the ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine. So most of the protest, most of the civil unrest is in the Ukrainian parts of the country, whereas the Russian and pro-Russian parts of the country have been relatively quiet. It also shows in the upper left-hand corner, the areas in blue are areas where Yanukovych won in 2010, and the areas in the kind of yellowish-orangish color are areas that Tymoshenko won in 2010. Notice the division, right? Ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in the east, Ukrainians and Ukrainian speakers in the west. Yanukovych to the east, Tymoshenko to the west. The country is almost two countries in that regard. Heavy industry is in the east, big industry, iron and steel industries, coal mines, very, very large, important industrial base in eastern Ukraine, relatively little industry in western Ukraine. Hold that thought. This is an export map. This is a percentage of exports from each of these provinces of Ukraine. Notice that the eastern parts of the country are the largest exporting parts of the country. Guess where they export to? Never end a sentence with a preposition, I'm sorry. To where do most of those exports go? They go to Russia. Okay, I skipped over a slide, but I wanted to. Well, no, let me go back. Russia wants and needs Ukraine much more than does the EU. Hold that thought. Olympics, big deal right now, right? Who put on the Olympics? That guy did. Forget about all the corruption stuff and forget about all the environmental degradation, forget about all that stuff. It's a big Russian deal. And, you know, I was told by my colleagues that the opening ceremonies featured some extraordinary, I didn't see them, I'll go back and look at them, but it's all about Russia stuff, big Russia stuff, everybody's excited about Russia, Putin's excited, if Putin's excited, everybody's excited, right? He is the guy, he is a de facto dictator, forget about the elections, they're all rigged, okay, he's your guy, okay. Why do we care? World's largest exporter of natural gas, and number 2 exporter of oil. Where do the pipelines go? The pipelines go from Russia right through Ukraine. Most of them. A couple of them go up north through Belarus, but the big one goes right through Ukraine. Ukraine being not only the transit area, back in the Soviet era when these pipelines were laid down, nobody cared. They were all part of the Soviet Union. Who cared? But now they're not. Now Ukraine's an independent country. And Russia's big natural gas exports, they are in the process of building a big new pipeline, see it through the Baltic Sea, under the sea, called Nord Stream. It's not online yet. So Russia's exports to Central Europe and Western Europe, especially to Germany, go through Ukraine. Ukrainians take advantage of that. They steal gas from the pipelines. Russia uses as a lever on Ukraine by playing games with the price of the gas that they sell to Ukraine. So it's kind of a geopolitical factoid, right? Why is it so? Because that's where Ukraine is. And the pipeline goes through there. Until other pipelines are constructed, it's a fact of life. It's realist politics. Exports and imports real quick. Russia is the leading export recipient and the leading source of imports. Within the EU, Germany is by far the largest in imports, other than Italy, which gets a lot of gas from Russia, from Ukraine, through Ukraine, actually. So Russia has a much bigger stake in the link between Russia and Ukraine is much more important economically than it is between Ukraine and Europe writ large. And then notice the note at the bottom. Ukraine has a huge balance of payments problem. And the number 1 debtor country, of course, is Russia. Russia uses that as a geopolitical hammer every time they want to beat up on Ukraine. And most of that is natural gas. Not all of it, but most of it. And if Russia really wants to put the squeeze on Ukraine, they jack up the inspection of goods transiting the Russia-Ukraine border. Slow down exports, which they've just recently done. And then, of course, the whole Russia deal. What's up with that? Well, it's that guy, right? Plus a Russia that now is much more aggressive internationally, aren't they? I mean, just look at the newspapers. They're active in the Iran deal. They're very active in the Syria situation. They're flexing their muscles. They invaded Georgia, for crying out loud, and crushed that little Caucasian republic because of a border dispute. That's where the tanks are going. That's in South Ossetia, which is on the Georgia-Russian frontier. So Russia is resurgent, and they're angry. That's the Crimea. The map on the left, that's part of Ukraine. Territorially part of Ukraine. Historically, it's not part of Ukraine, but Khrushchev added it to Ukraine in 1954. So now, with the borders didn't change, right? Hardly any Ukrainians live there. Mostly Russians live there, plus the indigenous people called the Crimean Tatars live there. Relatively few Ukrainians live there. It happens to have, on that peninsula,